Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the penultimate session of this year's GIF. I'm delighted to be talking today to Richard Banfield of InVision. My name is Craig Wightman of Kinneir Dufort, and I'm very pleased to be able to be joined by Richard this afternoon. Welcome, Richard.
Hi, Craig. How are you doing?
Good, good. So by way of introduction, Richard's head of design transformation at InVision, and as part of that work, Richard reaches out to actually a wide range of leading businesses on the subject of design management and leadership, and the design maturity assessment program that InVision run allows their customers to self-assess their maturity and benchmark themselves against peers in similar industries, helping to identify areas of opportunity and improvement. And I'm sure there'll be lots of lessons to be learned from this afternoon's discussion. I'm sure plenty of you listening in to this one should have some good takeaways from Richard's thoughts. So. Just to say also, we'll to mention Sally, who's from Live Illustration team, who's going to be capturing our discussion in Live Illustration's inimitable style that you've now all become very familiar with, and there's a lot of appreciation for that work. Well done, Sally. She's going to be doing that, so we'll pick up on that from time to time just to see how that's developing. We'll also try and capture any questions, and Richard, maybe we'll just sort of try and save a bit of time at the end just to cover any questions that come in during the session. Right. Good. So we'll lots to talk about this afternoon. We'll be talking about how teams can successfully collaborate in a bit, but it'd be good to start with really the theses that we talked about before that you developed that led to the work in this area. Really, that that issue that you identified, that people and teams are increasingly struggling sometimes to work together. Can you share some thoughts on that diagnosis and why you think that's the case?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the introduction, Craig. I think we just assume that because we're supposed to work together and because we do work together that we know how to do that well. And so when we say those things out loud, when we say the thesis out loud that it's difficult and complicated for people to work together in the current complex world that we live in, I often get people taking a second take at that and going, really? Because we work together all the time and people are doing things all the time together. It doesn't seem that might be the issue. But if you take a moment and you think about how you work with your teams, how you work with others, how you've seen others work, we really are struggling. There are tensions and difficulties in all teams, regardless of the maturity, where it isn't that obvious that we know how to work together. And of course, in today's modern working environments, those teams are dynamic. They're changing all the time. So you're bringing in new faces, new perspectives, new backgrounds, diverse perspectives of that. And that means that the nature of the team is changing, the qualities of the team and the characteristics of the team are changing. And that dynamic obviously brings with it its own complications. And so as we move towards a world where we understand the value of diversity and inclusion and how important diversity of perspectives is, we've also added that as another thing that we have to deal with. We want the inclusion, we want the diversity because that brings more creative solutions, but it also makes it more difficult to get alignment or understanding or even to relate to each other in many cases. And what's happening is the teams are skipping ahead quickly to the work and not spending enough time getting to know each other. They're not spending time getting aligned. And as it is in any relationship, even if it's a marriage or a friendship, if you're not aligned and you're working at odds with each other or you're working towards a different goal or a different understanding of what that goal is, then you're going to get problems, right? You're going to get tension. There's going to be friction. And so we want the creative tension that comes from diversity, but we don't want the destructive tension that comes from not understanding. And that's a really, really key point, is we want to seek out diverse perspectives and backgrounds and interests to make these teams more creative, but we also want to spend time developing the alignments and the understandings that are required for that diversity to actually be a creative tension versus a negative tension.
Yeah, and that when you're talking about teams, Richard, I guess with it's tempting to think with InVision you're talking about creative teams, but I think you're not really just referring to that. It's more fundamental than that, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, originally, so my background is I'm actually a biologist, and then I got into design. And one of the reasons why I liked the product design world is because it actually represented a lot of what we see in just normal fabrics of networks, whether it be biological or physical networks. And so there wasn't much work to be done in making that transfer or making the connection between what's happening in the product world and what's happening in almost every single other industry or space. A really good example is I spend time with the Formula One racing teams in Barcelona during their testing, which they do at the beginning of each season. And I was struck at how much cross-functionality is going on. You've got teams that range from the smallest size teams of a few hundred to, say, Mercedes-Benz, which has got, I think, like 1,200 members on that team. Even though the focus is on the driver or those two drivers on the team, you've got several hundred people that are working in a cross-functional way to produce this outcome. Not only that, but they're doing it in a way that is well beyond the dynamics of what we would consider to be normal in a software or product environment. They're literally moving this Super Bowl level experience from one location to another, taking all the technologies, taking all the people problems with them. And these dynamics are things that they've had to figure out over many decades of work. So we can actually learn from the organizations not like software and see what they're doing and see where high performance teams are performing well and borrow from those ideas and not try and, first of all, break the illusion that somehow innovation only exists in that kind of Silicon Valley context. That's the first thing we need to get over. And then the second thing is we have so much to learn from industries outside of what we do. And there is more to learn than we can possibly imagine. So it's good to spend time looking at those high performance teams, seeing how they operate, why they operate like that, what problems that they've faced in the past, and whether those problems are similar to the ones that we face.
Sure.
And I'll say this one kind of final point is every single company that I talk to, and I speak to about 15 Fortune 500 companies a week, every single one of them says to me, oh yeah, we're unique. Our problems are different to everybody else's problems. And within 15 minutes, we realize, nope, they're not. They're exactly the same problems that everybody else is having, because the fundamental units of innovation is the team and the people on the team. And those things are not unique. They are absolutely ubiquitous across every single team. Sure.
Obviously, this year, all teams have had some new challenges to work with. Has your observation around that, has that made effective collaboration harder? I mean, almost inevitably it has, but conversely, perhaps have you noticed some really positive effects coming out of that enforced different working arrangement?
I mean, it's both positive and negative. I think we've seen a healthy balance of both. But most importantly, I think what the pandemic and us all having to work remotely or being socially distanced in our working collaboration, what it's done is it's shone a very bright light on what we were doing. And if what we were doing was working well and we had a lot of alignment and we had a lot of collaborative energy and positive, that positive tension that I talked about earlier, if you have all of the good elements in place already, then something like a pandemic tends to amplify those good things. If the on the other end of the spectrum, if things are poorly done, if you've got bad alignment, poor alignment, bad behavior, those things tend to get amplified as well. So really, it's a little like turning the lights on in the kitchen late at night and seeing all the cockroaches and rats running around. They're there, but until you turn that light on, you're not quite sure that they're visible. And I think this is what we've seen most, and I think this is a positive, is we've seen the the exit of the micromanager. So the micromanager is like one of those cockroaches that gets revealed when you turn that switch on late at night. That bad behavior is very, very difficult to sustain in this environment, because it becomes immediately obvious that it's micromanagement and not positive reinforcement or alignment or, driving through principles or any of the other strong leadership elements that we see in high performance teams. So we're seeing folks that were working in environments that were not healthy expose those unhealthy bits, and in many cases then able to deal with them, and I think that's the positive. If they're unable to deal with them, then well, that's a negative, and that's maybe the demise of that team or that group or that organization. So I think that the pandemic has been, as hard as it is, and I don't want to make light of it, I don't want to make it out as if it's a good thing. So many people have lost their lives, and so many of us have been disrupted by it. But I think for business, it's been an opportunity for us to take a long, hard look at what we do and investigate and interrogate the things that are working and are not working, and then build on those things that are positive, and maybe start dealing with the things that are negative and getting rid of those.
Good. Okay. Let's talk a bit about your design maturity assessment work at InVision. I know from speaking to you before that there's a pretty robust data set behind that's informed some of your findings. Can you talk a bit about that? What the design maturity assessment is, and how it's working, and how that's generated the data that's allowed you to start to form some conclusions?
Yeah. The design maturity assessment started out as a research project called the New Design Frontier. Leah Bewley and Aaron Walter started this about 2.5 years ago, and they researched what are the elements that are common in mature teams, these high performance teams that we're talking about today. We like to refer to them as mature teams. That's just our term. I think that's probably interchangeable for high performance. And what Leah and Aaron wanted to understand is, are there patterns, are there commonalities between these teams? Could we conceivably survey a group and see whether the behaviors within that group are consistent or correlative with these kinds of outcomes? And they did. The original study reached out to about 2,200 individuals across several thousand companies, or maybe several hundred companies, I should say, all over the world. And since then, we've added to that data set. We have about 8,500 individual surveys now being registered in that data set, and we can slice and dice it accordingly. And what we see from that data, when we match it up with the qualitative conversations we have every day with these Fortune 500 companies, these product teams and their high performance teams, is that there are certain things that are common to mature teams, and they tend to be the things that are intuitive and obvious, but very difficult to achieve. So just like, I might say to you, hey, be kind, be gracious, be empathetic. Well, that's good advice, and I'm sure we all agree on that, but it's difficult to be that all the time, every day, especially if you've got, like I have, a 4-year-old who's bugging you, in the middle of your day. Can you be empathetic and kind in that exact moment? So what we see in these high-performing teams is that they tend to be less feature factory-like. In other words, they're not just bums in seats doing work for a particular task, but rather they're seeking to create flow efficiency between the original vision, or whatever the original problem was that they were trying to solve, through to delivering of that value to the end user or the customer. And so that flow efficiency looks very, very similar across a lot of these organizations. The first thing we see in these flow efficient organizations is that they don't pretend that they can create time. So this is the moment of truth, is when you ask these teams to show you their roadmap and their calendars and see how well their calendars match up to the reality of what they're supposed to be doing. And you see a lot of gaps there, right? You see a lot of tension in, wow, I'm doing too many things, or I'm doing the wrong kinds of things. So the first thing you realize then is that they're very realistic. They've bound themselves around the time constraint, and they don't believe that they can make up time or that they can create time. and that is their primary constraint. And they really are quite disciplined about that. They then take the next step, which is to say, okay, in order for us to be smart about using our time, who are the individuals that need to be involved in that work during that period of time? And so they're disciplined about bringing the right people together. What Jim Collins in Good to Great would write about getting the right people on the bus and putting the right people in the right seats. So similar kind of concept. And what we, beyond just the Jim Collins metaphor of the people on the bus, we see these teams being very thoughtful about the level of diversity and inclusivity. So they're not just putting a bunch of white guys on a bus because they all look the same and they all speak the same language and they all have done similar things, but they're asking, where does the perspective that we need going to come from? And is that a diverse perspective that we would value or the customer would value in this? And then, of course, by nature, that's a cross-functional team. So they're very often bringing in the designers, the developers, the engineers, in some cases, even regulators and marketers, to truly understand all of the complexities of that, the work that needs to be done. And then they were starting together. So these teams are working together from the beginning. They're not just cross-functional in name, but they're cross-functional in behavior. They wake up with each other, like they have that consistency of, we are going to work together at the beginning of this project, during this project, and at the end of the project, even if it means that some of those functions are not as highly engaged at each stage. So there's definitely a maturity in stage involvement or contribution, but they're all involved in the beginning and during and at the end, so that they can quickly nail down what potential blockages or problems there are and not have an issue at the end. So a good example of that is in highly regulated industries, these teams are putting a regulator on the team at the beginning instead of producing a thing and then sending it to legal at the end for a stamp of approval, which generally it doesn't get, right? If it's gone that far without having a regulator involved, then it's probably not going to get approved. And then that means having to rework and sending it back to the beginning of the process. And then I think we also see these teams being very problem-orientated as opposed to solution-orientated. They're spending a lot of time analyzing the problem. Is this the right problem to solve? Does the customer actually want this problem to be solved? And that's not to say there aren't good innovations or solutions that need a problem to solve, right? There's the backwards engineering of that as well. Like you might invent a new battery and say, well, where could we apply this? And there's that kind of scientific approach to that. But for the most part, teams that are developing product need to have a general understanding that the problem that they're solving is a problem worth solving. And they're constantly asking questions about that. And that tends to be the mindset that we see in these high-performing teams. And they're quite disciplined and rigorous about that. They can question their assumptions and the biases. And that leads to more of an outcomes-based relationship that they have instead of output. So they're not saying, well, let's go and produce, a prototype or a wireframe or whatever. They're saying, if we produce that thing, what is the outcome that will result from that? And does that actually address our problem? Does that validate our thesis or invalidate our thesis? And so you can see by this conversation that I'm quite excited by it, because as a scientist or somebody who was trained as a biologist, it's the same language. We're talking about hypotheses, we're talking about validation, we're talking about pattern recognition. So again, this is something we can learn from other industries. It's not something unique to product innovation or software innovation. It's something that's been around for a very, very long time, and we get a lot to learn from other people.
Yeah. No, that's it's a bit of a theme of GIF this year. It's popped up a few times really about, and Nick Tate yesterday made reference to it about falling in love with the problem in front of you rather than solutions that you might jump to. So I'm sure you'd endorse that that way of thinking. You probably answered some of this in that last piece, Richard, but just picking up a question from Octaviana here, who's asking about practical methods that we should bear in mind and use to effectively collaborate cross-functionally. Maybe sort of pick out a few things that you think are particularly important there.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to do it, and I don't want to be prescriptive. So Octavia, I don't want to tell you that there's like one way to do it, but there are certainly things that we've seen that are very helpful. I think in its in its current form, the design sprint is actually a really interesting format. And I've written a book on this, so I recuse myself in the sense that I'm like, I'm telling you about something I obviously have an interest in. There's a disclaimer there, but the design sprint isn't really that unique. We think of it as being something that Jake Knapp came up with, while he was working at Google Ventures. But the reality is that model's been around for a long time. In fact, we would, when I was a student back in university, we were using that exact same model. We called it the scientific method. It's you figure out what the problem is that you need to solve, or the thesis, and then you develop some way, an experiment of testing that idea. And so from a practical point of view, what you want to be able to do is understand the dynamics of something like a design sprint, or something that looks like that, where it's got these phased approaches where you start with the problem, then you figure out what kind of solution you'd like to test or experiment with, then you build that experimentation or that prototype, and then you validate or invalidate that. And you can do that in an extremely short period of time. Most design sprints are about 5 days, but we've worked with companies that have 3-day design sprints. I mean, that you don't really need to spend that much time understanding these things, because you'll be able to find answers to your questions relatively quickly. And that's ultimately the goal here, is to find an answer to a question. Are you answering the right question first? Of course, that you want to have the right question, but then finding those answers is really kind of the work of the product teams. And so what we see is the practicalities of this is spending more time talking. And I'll preface that by saying, when everybody's freaking out, watching this, going, yes, it's messy, and yes, it does take a little time, and yes, it does feel like you're slow at the beginning, and in some cases, if you're being really honest with yourself, it's a little expensive to begin with, right? Like there could be 5-10 people in a room, and you're talking for a few hours, and you think, geez, this is the best use of our time. Well, yes, if it's structured, and you're able to identify what those problems are and how you can solve those problems and develop some kind of evidence-based way to test that, then it's not a waste of time, and it'll actually save you time. So the thing that I hear most often when people engage in these practical methods of experimentation is, wow, we discovered something that ordinarily takes us 6 months to do. Like, we did that in 3 or 4 days. And we were able to do that in, yes, a slightly messy way that doesn't always feel like it's perfectly routine and doesn't have like a cadence, like a sprint cadence to it. But the reality is, what you're trying to do there is just get out what it is that everybody is trying to do, and you're trying to expose all that stuff so that you can get alignment. And that is messy. That's messy in relationships. It's messy in marriages. It's messy in relationships with your friends. Like, unless you're actually exposing what those assumptions are and having conversations about them and then testing them, you're not really going to be able to drive towards a solution. So again, design sprint works well. I wouldn't call it a design sprint if I had my choice over again. I wouldn't use that, because I think it's kind of suggests that it's only for designers, but it's big D design. It's design thinking. It's kind of problem solving. It should be called, the problem solving method, or the scientific method in that sense. And in that case, you'll do all those things that flow efficient teams do. It's time bound. It's inclusive. It's cross functional. It has a dynamic versus a rigid framework. It's outcomes based versus outputs, and it's problem centered. So it actually is a microcosm. It's almost like a cheat sheet for how these mature high performance teams work at scale. If you can learn to do it in a design sprint type environment where you're doing it just for a few days, you can learn that practice, you can learn that methodology, and then slowly but surely build the muscle so that it can become team or organizationally scaled.
So I'm interested in that, whether, because I've seen that happen many times of on a sprint or even in a quicker thing like a hackathon or something, where people from different backgrounds thrown together at an instant, suddenly gel and do amazing things. Now, is that partly because lots of other stuff that goes with organizations can be ignored for that because it's a time limited event, and it's very focused on what's achieved. So I can well understand that it provides that microcosm of what you're ultimately trying to achieve. You know, how many big businesses have said, why can't we act more like startups?
Mm-hmm.
So is there something about that, and is there are there methods that try to keep that stuff and not let the other things that might get in the way of good working collaborations that are evident by their absence in a sprint or a short activity that we can really bring forward and learn? Maybe that's part of what you do in the design maturity work.
Certainly, I think that any time you've given focus and that time-bound focus to work on a specific problem or a specific question, there is going to be a strong outcome or a better outcome than if you're just randomly trying to solve stuff on the fly. Having said that, though, I think that what I was kind of hinting at earlier is it's a mindset, right? So once you've done the design sprint type work, you will take that kind of work, that mindset, you'll take that approach back into a normal cadence of work. And so even if you're only using a design sprint to start a project or at some punctuation point during that project, maybe every quarter or something to solve a big gnarly problem, you'll notice that the learning is not unlearned. It's not a discrete thing that you only do in that environment. You actually learn to behave in a way that is collaborative. You learn to behave in a way that's cooperative. You learn empathy. You learn understanding. You learn discovery. And that isn't something you can unlearn. It's just like teaching children. Once you've taught a child a certain concept, it's not that they just immediately forget. They're like, oh, okay, that's a ball. That's the shape that it is. I can kick it. I can pick it up. And the same is true of the design sprint activities. Those activities are new mindsets that can't be unseen. Once you've seen them, you're like, oh, yeah, it's a really good idea to ask these kinds of questions or approach these things. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to be immediately adopted. What we see is adoption curves, are different for every company and depending on the digestive system of that organization. But what we've seen during COVID is that organizations that ordinarily may have taken years to make this part of the norm have accelerated it. And what we heard from a recent chief information officer is that they took a 4-year plan and pushed it into a 4-month time box and were able to execute on it. And I think that's the real lesson for innovators here is that once you create different incentives, you start to see different results. And our incentives aren't always orientated or at least aligned with innovation. They're normally, especially in large organizations, our incentives are aligned with keeping the status quo, making sure that the thing doesn't break. Once you've got that big product out there, you're a bank or you're an infrastructure company, you don't really want things to break. That's part of the value proposition, is that it's reliable and it's consistent. So the bureaucracy that you put in place to maintain that, it has a purpose. It's not just bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake. It actually has a good incentive. But that same incentive, of course, is working against the opportunity for innovation. So you do have to drag these moments out of the normal cadence and create these time box opportunities for innovation to happen. And I won't go any further on to this except to say that Safi Bakal's book, Loon Shots, that's Loon Shots, is one of the best books I've ever read on creating the structures and incentives for innovation. And it does point to exactly what we're talking about here. It points to the way that you structure the team, the way you incentivize the team, and of course, what kind of skills are necessary in each of those groups, what kind of cross-functional moments are necessary for that team to go out into the world and find the knowledge they need or the answers they need, and then come back and say, hey, we've got something it's worth us investing in, it's worth us doing something about.
That's interesting. There's a tension between some of the organizational excellence and innovation. Just on that theme, picking up another question from the audience. So Veronica is really asking about Agile, actually, and whether there's a sort of conflict between Agile and deep problem understanding. I guess, a number of your teams that you collaborate and work with, Richard, presumably have Agile embedded into their processes. What's your sort of observation of that in relation to the successful collaboration?
I've mixed feelings about Agile. I think that it has it's been a very, very strong influence on shifting our mentality away from a linear way of working, a waterfall way of working, towards a more iterative way of working. I think that's the principles that drove the ideas, that the framework that ultimately became Agile are as solid today as they were back 25 years ago. I think the execution part of it has failed a little bit. I think that what we've done is replace one dogma for another dogma. So, waterfall was a dogma. You write requirements, and then you kind of went through a linear process to deliver the value. And then we said, well, that's not working as well, and we're kind of losing value along the line, and there's lots of rework. Let's do this other thing, which is more iterative. But where Agile may not quite be relevant for everybody is that when you're talking about innovation, and this is an innovation conference, so I want to make that clear, it's that in those organizations where you're trying to keep the trains on time, Agile is great. It's one of those things that there's a lot of rigor, a lot of discipline, there's a lot of thoughtfulness that goes into each stage, but it's not very innovative. You don't really see, you get stuck in a local maximum, right? There's a very little opportunity for Agile-driven organizations to explore brand new horizons. And I think that that's relevant, at least to this conference, something to consider. If you're on a team that is trying to make a big breakthrough, or you're trying to deliver value in an innovative way, then you need to ask that question. Like what are we trying? What are we structured to do? What are we incentivized to do? And Agile is not incentivizing you to break everything and start something new. It's helping you keep things working, which in is of itself very valuable. Like, don't get me wrong, there's a great book called The Innovation Delusion, which points to the fact that we're so focused on the new that we forget about the old. And the fact that you got to work to do your innovation was the result of the fact that bridge and that train and that road actually is maintained and it works, right? So you can't ignore the fact that we need to maintain infrastructure and maintain some part of the status quo in order for innovators to have a place to go and do their work. But I think you just have to be mature enough to know that what you're doing maybe on a day-to-day basis to achieve one outcome isn't the same thing you would do to achieve a similar outcome in a different area, like innovation.
Yeah. Sadly, we're out of time, Richard, but maybe just I wanted to just cheekily ask one last question. So if members of our GIF audience here feel that some of your thoughts have resonated with them, and there's something they want to do about improving collaboration within their team very quickly, are there any sort of one or two word answers to where they might start?
Yeah, I think the first thing to do is start by getting into a room together and discussing your intentions. Really understand people's intentions, what their concerns are, and then start build boundaries around that. It's a good conversation. Get alignment by talking to people about what they're trying to do, because very often we don't talk about these things. We just arrive at work and we all think we're doing the same thing, and then find out, oh, I'm heading in this direction and you're heading in that direction. So it might seem like a very, very simple and almost unnecessary thing to do, but I guarantee you that in the 20-something years that I've been doing this, the number one thing that I find helps teams the best is just getting on the same page, discussing intentions, discussing concerns, getting some boundaries or some principles around how they're going to sort these things out, and then start working towards understanding each other and start working towards getting that alignment and having a vision and a set of values that align with all that stuff. I gave a talk at a conference a couple of years ago, and there were 1,200 people in the audience, and I asked anybody that stands up and can tell me their company's vision statement and their values without hesitation, I will give $100 to you. And only one person stood up. And I think that's just indicative of the fact that we're so in the weeds that we forget that we actually need a direction. We need a focal point. We need something to go and get excited about and a purpose to drive towards.
Yeah, that's a good note to finish on. Talk more, have a vision, align behind a purpose. So well, all in favor of that. That was a great pleasure talking to you, Richard. Thank you.
You too. Thank you
for that. We're not quite finished yet on GIF. We've got a highlight, certainly a sort of Tom's closing roundup, something I always look forward to. So you're up next, Tom. Stay tuned for that. My thanks again to Richard and to Sally for capturing that discussion. And enjoy the last bit of what's been a fantastic conference.